Hello, I'm James Cridland, the radio futurologist, and this is my International Radio Trends newsletter, but in podcast form. For March the 23rd, 2025, it's called The End of Local Radio in the UK, brackets, almost, close brackets. In news that will surprise nobody really, it's emerged that Bauer, one of the big two commercial radio broadcasters in the UK, will close all its local radio breakfast shows in England and Wales in June, meaning an end to any local radio production. There are 12 different local breakfast shows currently being broadcast, and those talented breakfast presenters will disappear, and one show, not yet announced, will be a national show. Listeners will get regional news and travel, as is mandated by law, and local ads as well. Back in 2010, more than 35 of Global's local radio stations were rebranded as Heart, with increasing networking happening, until in 2019 it shunted its local breakfast shows to the afternoon drive time slot. So their equivalent removal of all local programming in January this year was less of a big deal for listeners who'd been waking up to Jamie and Amanda for a long while. A well-executed strategy which has led to Heart becoming the most listened to commercial radio network in the UK with 10 million listeners. Bauer, on the other hand, appeared to dither with no clear plan. In 2013, for example, TFM in Stockton was closed, taking Metro FM programming from Newcastle, but with station names recorded separately by each presenter. So if you were listening in Newcastle, you would have heard, "It's Metro FM. Good morning, I'm such and such." Whereas in TFM, you'd have heard, "It's TFM. Good morning, I'm such and such." And that was basically how they ended up doing it. I think it was split cards. Anyway, in 2018, Key 103 in Manchester was rebranded as Hits Radio, merging with a national station called The Hits. In 2019, Bauer bought a number of local stations from Wireless, UKRD, Celador and Lynx, and all of the company's Heritage FMs broadcast a growing amount of networked programming from Hits, but all those stations retained their local branding on air for a further 5 years. Just a year later, though, they've lost their local breakfast personalities as well as their name. Hits Radio has 4.6 million listeners, excluding stations in Scotland and Northern Ireland, which are, true to Bauer's apparent dithering, yet to gain the Hits brand. And the big change of breakfast show will bring more uncertainty to those figures. Bauer also closes almost all of their station buildings. Over the past few years, Bauer has been closing station buildings all over the place, presumably coinciding with lease contracts, shifting local breakfast shows to neighbouring radio stations, some of which were 90 minutes drive out of the transmission area that they purported to serve. Viking Radio's breakfast show, for example, came from Sheffield. Bradford's The Pulse was moved altogether to Leeds and then fully networked. And those changes meant the closure of a further 8 radio station facilities, leaving Bauer with just 4 broadcasting hubs in the UK and 3 smaller production centres. Sheffield is one of those to close, which I spent 7 years at. The station was once a Carlsberg Tetley brewery distribution centre. And I've only now spotted the obvious place where the brewery sign was on the wall. Inside that building, by the way, a very large canteen and a very 1980s looking pub, both of which were just left to rot. The canteen was where all of the paperwork went just to be stored. The pub itself, you could just about see in through the windows, but it was a very old-fashioned thing. But nobody had been in there for a long, long time. Anyway, it's important, as I did in January, to highlight that listeners will still hear local information and local travel and local news, if more regional than local. Important, too, to highlight that these changes are happening in June, so broadcasters will have the opportunity to say goodbye. And some will stay with the company. Hits in Metro and TFM land, Newcastle and Teesside. Their broadcasters, Steve and Karen, will be on Hits Radio 90s, as one example, doing the breakfast show there. Because of the way that UK radio is licensed, that's probably it for local radio in most cities in England. Community radio does exist, but it's hobbled in terms of legislation and transmitter power. Almost all radio licenses of interest are now part of a large group, and mostly networked and automated. Even BBC Local Radio is networking too. Local isn't, as US radio consultants would have you believe, the most important thing of the future of radio. But relevance is, and something is lost when there won't be a local accent on the air, or a knowing mention of the M62 at this time of night, or slipping in a song for people coming back from the Steelers game. And that's all a shame. Next week, I'm talking in Ireland, where none of this has happened. Elsewhere, BBC Domestic Radio is to remain available to those of us overseas. It turns out, just not from the BBC. A new paragraph was quietly added to the BBC's FAQ last week, saying that the BBC domestic stations will remain on the same third-party platforms as before outside the UK, which suggests that TuneIn, among others, will continue to carry all of the stations moving forward. So you might remember a couple of weeks ago I congratulated the BBC on having a clear strategy. Yes, well, that aged, didn't it? Anyway, the BBC hasn't responded to me asking for more details, and, why should they? In Australia, switching problems meant that some radio stations, some ABC radio stations, were off for almost a day, which I find just astonishing. But there we are. Jacobs Media's tech survey is always an interesting read. 25,000 core listeners in the US asked questions about their radio listening. And one of the things I find particularly interesting is music is now not the number one reason to listen to radio anymore. The reason flipped in 2019 to be more about the people on the radio, not the music. And that's, of course, not saying don't play music, but it is saying, I suggest, to focus more on the human connection and shared experience that we get from radio, and not just to market your music mix. Also, just as importantly, people listen to the radio less because their favourite people are no longer on the air. Wonder if Bauer are aware of that. On my blog, I compare the definition of a podcast with the definition of radio and the big mistake they made in the US radio industry. And also on my blog, a list of some of the feeds from ABC News in Australia, the RSS feeds, I should say. Given that they don't publish any of them, I've worked out how to find them. Anyway, if you're in Dublin or in Chicago over the next few weeks, please get in touch. I would love to catch up. I'm speaking next at Radio Days in Ireland, in Dublin, then Evolutions in Chicago, then Radio Days North America in Toronto in Canada in early May, the podcast show in late May in London, Podcast Movement in Dallas in Texas, August the 18th to the 21st, Radio Days Asia, I assume, September the 1st to the 3rd, and looking forward to Pennine Radio's 50th birthday, which is even more poignant now, in Bradford. I will be there, guaranteed now, because I've booked the flight, and I'm also speaking at Pod Summit YYC, which is in Calgary in Canada, September the 19th to the 20th. I should thank my many supporters. Who shall I choose? Media Realm. Hello, Media Realm. Soma FM, Broadcast Radio, and Brun Radio Consulting Limited. Plus, I should thank Greg Strassel, Sam Phelps, Richard Hilton, Emma Gibbs, Jocelyn Abbey, and James Masterton for being regular supporters. Super appreciate that. It's very, very kind of you. It keeps me actually doing this, which is probably a good thing. If you would like to support my work in any way, you can. Buymeacoffee.com/James Cridland is the easiest way. That's where you can become a member to give regularly, or just give a one-off coffee or $5. I'm on Blue Sky as james.crid.land if you want to follow me there, or on Mastodon, which is probably the best place to follow me, James at bne.social. That's Brisbane, bne.social. My website has more details about who I am and what I do and whether I can help you further. And thank you for listening, and keep listening.